Thanks for tuning in, guys. We might have a small group. I'm going to give a couple minutes and see if anyone signs up, anyone else comes in, and we'll get started. Faye and Nolan, I'm going to make this kind of interactive just because it's a really, I think, a pretty short class if it's just going on the basics of writing a land contract. So if you guys have any questions, make sure and jump in and ask anything you might be curious about or anything you might have experienced so far. What kind of experience have we got out there? Is everybody practicing now? Is anybody reading contracts? Is anybody brand new? You guys unmute yourselves. Talk to me a little bit. Hey, Jake.
Hey, Frank, you all right, mate?
Good. Well, I bored Jason to death. Hey, John, how are you? Has anybody done a land transaction yet?
I have not.
I have not yet either.
Well, is that you, Nolan? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Faye, are you an assistant now? Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm an admin for Austin. So I just try to get as much information as possible. I do contract to close for him. So, and I know he has a couple land properties, so that's why I'm here.
Awesome. And John, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You were muted, John. Hit your little the little mute button there. There you go.
I've done some house lots and just some raw land.
Okay.
In
Yeah.
fact, recently, like Pulaski County, Patrick County, Botetourt.
Good deal. Yeah, I mean the process is pretty simple. It's basically the same as any residential contract. It's just a little simpler. Very dumbed down version of the contract if you use the Roanoke Valley Association of Realtors land agreement. And I've got a few notes that I wrote, and I'm going to share my screen now and show you what I figured we do, and I want it interactive. So if anybody has a question as we go through, just stop me, or I think there's a button to raise your hand. And I'll have Kelsey keeping an eye on the messages. So if you guys want to type something with a question, just throw it out there. Anyway, what I plan to do is share my screen, and I'll just kind of buzz through a contract. I'm not going to waste any time on it, but I've already started in zip form, basically started a contract, added the documents and added buyer seller information. So the basics are there. And then we're just going to go line for line and hit any questions anybody has and try to make it simple and interactive. So hang on a second. Let me get my share screen set up here and see if we can get started on this contract. Maybe. Okay. So this contract, I pulled an MLS sheet, this particular MLS sheet from Paragon, just to have something to work from. 27 acres, 337.5 is the list price. And when I write a document in zip form or command or DocuSign, I always make sure that my contract includes the MLS agreement or the MLS sheet. And I do it for a few reasons. One, so I'm make sure that I'm selling the right property. Two, if you see there, they always have buyer agent fee. I want to make sure that we're not supposed to write that into a contract. So I want to make sure it's addressed by way of having this as an attached addenda to the contract. I think that's simplest way to make sure everybody's on the same page. And at the bottom, I have my client via DocuSign or in person, I have my client initial and date this MLS sheet. So we're all on the same page as to what's expected, commission, what's expected, what property we're selling, etc. So let me close that one out and I'm going to go. And each of these is different. I mean, if you're selling a piece of land that has a house on it or some sort of a structure, most of the time, if it's just raw land, you're not going to have all the extra addenda. And the summary of rights, I'll throw that into a land agreement, but I don't include the residential property disclosure because that deals with improved property. But the summary of rights and obligations explains what is expected of you when you're selling a property, real property. So disclosure of brokerage relationship. And this is how I operate. I do it the same way every single time. So there's never a question about whose interests are represented or anything else. But I'll always have, if I represent the seller, I'll have the seller put an initial under the seller section, the buyer the same. And if it's going to be a dual agency or a designated agency transaction, I'll have them both initial. So everybody's on the same page as to who's represented and what's expected. And I don't do dual agency. Instead, I'll use this disclosure of brokerage relationship in addition to my other documents to make sure they understand, the parties understand that I don't represent one party or I don't represent the other. So that page 2 of the disclosure of brokerage relationship is a nice place to cover that agency, who's representing who. So exclusive right, you guys should all be using that to make sure it's addressed who the client is in the transaction. With a land purchase, you can use either the purchase agreement, residential property purchase agreement, or the land. I prefer the land because it's a little simpler and has a little less of the boilerplate language that you have associated with a residential home sale. So click on that. And if you get started on this document, the date, the seller, the purchaser, and then the pertinent data for the transaction. If it's Montgomery County, check the county. And we don't have very many cities around here. City of Radford and city of Roanoke. What do you guys have there? Salem, Vinton. There's a few in your area, but not so many up here in the mountains. But going through this, I mean, this takes a few minutes to run a contract, but it's not much time at all. So subdivision, legal description of the property, acreage. This property said it was 27 acres. And this is a point that I'll make when I get to additional terms in this contract, but I always put in the acreage that's expected, plus or minus. And then when we get to the additional terms, paragraph 21, I write an additional phrase in there that reads land to be sold by the boundary, not by the acre. And the reasoning behind that is I've sold properties where they found out later that they thought they were selling 30 acres and instead they were selling 50. So if you have that term in there, it's going to make sure that it's inclusive of all the property inside the boundaries that you were told or that you expected. And sometimes surveyors miss. So I think it's a good practice to add that language. And anywhere you've got a blank, whether it's in finance terms or additional terms, add land to be sold by the boundary, not by the acre. That way you're not tied to 15 acres when you could have been selling 30. The parties involved, listing agent represents the seller, buyer's agent represents the buyer. And in the case of a designated agency deal, we're going to put down both the seller and the purchaser. Frank represents the seller, or Jake represents the seller, Frank represents the purchaser, and then Keller Williams represents both the buyer and the seller in a designated deal. And since Jake and I both work at Keller Williams, Realty Roanoke. So, of course, signatures by buyers and sellers here, signature and date, and any attached addenda. As I said before, I always include the MLS listing sheet. And this just ensures that it is an included document in the transaction. And I'm sorry for anybody that's done this a million times and has a lot of experience with it. But if I'm going too slow or too fast, let me know. Property Owners Association, typically raw land is not going to be located in. There are occasions when it is, but usually it's not. I'm not sure why that keeps popping up. Something odd about that and sharing on my screen. So if you do have a piece of land that's in an association, you need to get the packet so that everybody knows, the buyer knows what's expected of them, what the costs are. And then they've got a period of time with which to rescind. I think it's 3 days with raw land on an homeowners association. And at very least, I think it's a great idea to pull anything you can, whether it's from the county or whether it's from the agent's downloads on MLS, to pull the attached documents and disclosures. Because sometimes the deed and stuff like that actually has the restrictions, covenants and restrictions for the property. And sometimes somebody has a really specific purpose for what they want to use a property, and they can't do it. I'm selling a property now that actually has private covenants and restrictions on 20 acres of land. And it's a limit of 2 large animals. So 2 horses, 2 cows, 1 horse, 1 cow. And you can have a handful of chickens, a handful of goats. But if somebody wanted to have 20 head of cattle, you can't do it. And so they're going to violate the covenants and restrictions. And depending on if it's an active association, if somebody's going to be difficult to deal with, they may have to go to court and figure out how to get rid of some livestock if they have too many. So always, some of my notes here, find out their intentions. Anybody that wants to buy land, find out exactly what their use is. Do they want to build, or do they want to use it as a residential property? And the reasoning there is if they're going to build, we're probably going to have to deal with a well. We're probably going to have to deal with septic and the installation of utilities. And all those add different layers of onion peel that needs to be worked through in a contract. So if it's recreational, considerations have to be restrictions, boundaries, rights of way, easements. So there's a handful of things that you deal with every single time, and the more of these you do, the more quickly or the more you get used to it, the faster you can move through a transaction. Questions so far? Anybody?
Why don't you do dual agency?
I feel there's too much liability. I think and this is a business decision for an agent. So I don't want to speak for John. I don't want to speak for Faye, but in 19 years of business, I have not practiced dual agency, and it's because I was taught that nobody's actually represented in a dual agency situation. You can't truly work on behalf of a buyer and seller. Say, I'm going to help you negotiate the price, and I'm going to help you determine the price. You can't work on both sides of it. So what I found, two things. Before I had a team in place to deal with that situation, I would practice single agency, and one party's represented, one party is not, or I would refer out the other party to another agent. So at least you can pick up a part of it. The other piece of that is, if you've got a team, then you can handle both sides of the transaction under a designated agency situation. Buyers represented, sellers represented, but nobody ever claims to do something that, in my opinion, you can't do, and that is represent two parties equally. Somebody's going to get slighted. Somebody's going to not feel that you've done your job. And I don't care if they're your best friend. Somebody's going to feel like, yeah, Frank could have probably got me a better deal if he was working for me only. So just my personal opinion. And you guys, the challenge is, I think if that ever goes to court, a dual agency situation, if it goes to court, the judge is going to say that greedy old realtor just tried to pull both sides of this and didn't treat everybody fairly, or didn't work in their best interests.
Okay.
Anyways, I'm a soapboxer on that, John, but it served me well, and I figure you can pull both sides of the same transaction without saying I represent both parties. And if a buyer says, I absolutely have to have a buyer's agent, and you're representing the seller, refer it, man. I don't think it's worth it to have that potential liability to deal with. This is just my personal preference. On
Okay.
personal property,
Buyers that you end up talking to them so much and letting them know so much. I was under the impression, I was told that dual agency, the only thing you don't negotiate for each side is you just take price offers back and forth. You don't negotiate the price, it's between them two, just for you to carry offers back and forth, but everything else you can do.
so if I have the choice between saying, I'm going to be an independent contractor for this transaction, where I don't have any of that implied agency or implied representation, versus I'm going to be a dual agent and everybody expects me to do these things representing their interest. That's the fear that I have, is somebody has unrealistic expectations about that representation. So the way I get around it is, in that disclosure of brokerage relationship, I've got a document there, page 2, that says the parties acknowledge that Frank does not represent this party. So if I'm the listing agent, I don't represent the buyer, but I'm going to treat them honest. I'm going to treat them fair, and I'm going to do all those functions except that negotiating part, except that part where they feel like I've got them by the hand and I'm pulling them through it. They're going to have to come up with that price.
Right.
So as an unrepresented buyer, they're going to get all that perfect functionality of having a great agent working for them, but I've not signed a document that makes me liable for everything and anything under the sun that could come out of that.
Okay.
I think personally, I think it's just a smacking a bee's nest with a stick. I think eventually it's going to come back, and you might get 20 deals done under dual agency, but eventually it's going to come back and bite you. So I've made it a practice to not do dual, and that's a lot of transactions over 19 years. But I know a lot of agents who do it, and I've known agents who've done it for 30, 40 years successfully. But I think if you have a business, if you have a standard that you set your standards in the business, and if you have a standard that you follow every single time, then you set a precedent. So if you ever are taken to court, you can show that over your career in the business, you've done your business this way, and there should have never been an implication of I was a dual agent, or I told this person one thing when I didn't. follow your business practice the same way that you follow your business routine. Get up at 5 a.m, take a cold shower, start your lead gen at 9 o'clock, work it until 11. I'm very systematic, and I have to be, because I'm too stupid to do anything otherwise. And that way it follows suit for me. It makes it easy for me to not ever question about or be questioned about doing the right thing.
Okay, good explanation. Thank you.
I'm sorry I ramble there, but it's definitely something you've got to choose if you want to or don't want to do it in the business.
Okay,
I bring up personal property because typically dealing with a lender with a transaction, you are very limited as far as personal property, as far as if it can or can't be included in your contract, because it may or may not affect your appraisal. In a land transaction, it's very different. Typically with land, I deal with larger tracts of land. I deal with a company called Farm Credit, and they're a really cool company, and they have a really cool program. They charge a little bit more up front on a purchase, but they actually pay dividends, year-end dividends to the purchasers, which offsets the higher down payment. So if a normal lender charges you 10% on a conventional purchase, Farm Credit charges you 20, but year end they make up that difference by paying out a dividend, which offsets the higher cost on the purchase up front. At the end of the class, everybody who signed up, I'm going to send out a list of some of my allies in the business. One of those is Farm Credit, a guy named Steve Bowman, and he does almost all of my rural land and construction land transactions. That Farm Credit package, the fact that they pay out dividends year end is really a nice offsetting component. Additionally, if I wanted to throw in a jacuzzi or an RV or a tractor or a pile of firewood or a barn, they don't care. They're like, yeah, whatever. Doesn't make any difference as far as the appraisal, and it's not going to upset the apple cart on the sale. So they're handy to have around. Additionally, we'll get into it, but I've included in that list septic people, well people, just some handy businesses that I use for these land transactions. So purchase price, you're going to come up with whatever the price is when you deal with your client. Down payment, just same as a house. Most sellers expect 1% of the sales price for the down payment or earnest money deposit. And then I usually am very, very loose with the price language in any contract. I give the price, I give the basics, but I don't get into, if I set the price here and then I say this is the exact price or this is the price per acre, I think it's very limiting. So if I check the exact price, it makes a lot less edits that I've got to make later after we get through negotiation. Some people might be very specific about it, but I think if you know your price going in, then you have the direction you want to go. I didn't mention it later in this contract, but surveyors, I think it's a great idea to have a property surveyed, and many properties that we sell don't have a survey. Years ago, back in the 90s, the banks required a survey for anything you bought or sold, whether it was a house, whether it was land. It was kind of an expectation, and we've gotten away from that, but I think it's just a good idea to have a survey. You may or may not get one from a seller, and your buyer may or may not want to pay for one if the seller is not willing. But I think it's a great idea to have a survey. Earnest money, we don't hold earnest money, so Keller Williams, we take earnest money to the settlement office, whoever's closing the transaction, and we never touch it. Lenders First Trust, with that Farm Credit, you're gonna call this conventional finance, and if you use that company, but in section B there, you're just going to name the type of financing you're using. And again, with finance, I keep the terms really loose. I typically steer away from putting in a percentage rate. I'll put whatever their EMD is and whatever their down payment's gonna be and subtract it from the price. So I don't have to get into a whole lot of detail about all the specifics on their loan. And if a seller expects more, then we can certainly fill in the blanks, but it's just not necessary. Other financing terms, if there are very specific terms, maybe you've got a portion of owner financing, or maybe you've got a deposit subject to a deposit being paid by an owner's parent or a buyer's parent. Just cover the basics, make sure the information's out there. And then cash contract, you're going to have a letter from the bank within X number of days, or you're going to have your finances secured and final approval. Application made for the loan within blank days and final approval on or before. Typically, I write this for whatever my closing date is, so that I don't have to make approval at an unreasonable time. And for the most part, that flies by with no problems. But some people might say, I want to make sure we've got your final loan approval by 10 days before closing. If that's the case, then you just have to make sure and set your expectations with the lender so they know. And they're going to review your contract as well. They should be reviewing your contract. Page number 4, I took some notes here, and some of these I think are really important. And again, stop me if there are questions. Soil study. Hang on, I missed one of the paragraphs. Engineering and feasibility. So this is kind of an all-encompassing get out of jail free card, this paragraph 10. I say that because you can pretty much write in your days and that it is subject to a feasibility study. And this language goes for commercial property, for land, and can be used for residential. But the idea behind an environmental feasibility, any of these study periods, is that it's a timeline for you to have any inspections you want to have done to ensure that the property will work for your use, or that the property's safe, or that it doesn't have a buried dump hidden on the property or whatever. So I call this a get out of jail free period language. Typically, you're going to write in a 10 or 20 day feasibility study period to make sure you've got time to get in specialists to inspect or examine anything you need to have checked out. The next section is your soil study. This is where you're going to check to see that the land will perk for septic system. I've got 2 different, and I will occasionally, if it's somebody buying for recreational, I'll only check paragraph 10. But if it's somebody that wants to build a house, I'll typically do both, feasibility period as well as a soil study. And hopefully they'll overlap a bit and give me enough time to do what I need to have done. The soil study is potentially a little more invasive and potentially a little slower. But I'm going to tell you in that list I'm having Kelsey send out, I'm going to tell you the people I use for these things. The first is a guy named Steve Dalton. I think he's in Withville or Hillsville. And he is actually, I'm not sure what his credentials are, but he's a soil analyst. And he comes out, just an old farm boy, he comes out with a hand core tool, and he bores this thing down into the ground 3 or 4 feet deep, and he pulls up a plug and then analyzes it. And he gives you a really quick yes or no. This will work for septic system. The soil perks, water will flow through it because it's light clay, heavy sand, whatever the standards are for what he's looking for. Second option that's on that list is a company called Soil Works, and that woman's name is Nan Gray. She is actually a PhD soil engineer. I don't know what all her credentials are, geologist, and she knows everything. The challenge with Nan is she's much more expensive. Steven is a few $100. Nan is going to be a few grand. In addition, with a soil engineer, the latter, you actually have to have a person with a piece of equipment to come out and dig perk sites. And then Nan will come out, she'll look at the land, she'll tell them where she wants the sites dug. And then while they're scooping them out with a bucket, she jumps in the holes and she's got a little test kit. She's looking at the soil very, very carefully. And so the last one engineering report I had her do, she actually identified like 22 different soil types in 3 different pits. Very, very critical of the type of soil you're looking at. Both of these people, when you pay them to do the job and you send them out, they both can take, after they've done their job, an application to the health department wherever you're having your house, your septic system evaluated. They'll apply for the app or do the application for the system, and they'll actually draw out the type of system that they would approve. So from inspection to full permit, they make all that happen. And the cost, you're a couple, $3,000 for the soil engineer. You're let's say 500 to $1,000 for the soil analyst. Both are effective, both work, and there are other options for that. Almost all counties have the ability to send out somebody who's on the county payroll to do it, and it's a lot cheaper, but they are backed up. So you're probably looking at 6 or 8 months to have that done by the county or the ordinance where the property is located.
How many
So-
did we allow for number 10 and how many days for number 11?
So I think a good thing, one, is to find out what somebody wants to do. I've had people say, I don't care about any of this. I'm just going to buy it so I can hunt it. And if they do, then mark the first one that it is not subject to. And in the soil study, if they're not going to build, probably the same, unless they're really worried that they're going to build 5 years from now and they want to make sure that they could put a system on. So an engineering study period, if you look at 10 business days, I mean, that's a pretty lengthy amount of time. I've written these as long as 20 or 30. Sellers and other agents sometimes can get anxious about waiting that long for an evaluation. So I'd be in the range of 10 or 15 days on either of these, and they're both denoted in business days. And this is, you're going to figure out, one, what the engineer or the inspector or whomever you're soliciting, what their timeline is to get an appointment. And I say do that when you sit down at the table with your client, figure out what they want to have checked out, and then make a couple calls and find out how long it's going to take to have those things done. And if they say 2 weeks, then give it 3. If they say 3 weeks, give it 4. Just always try to make sure you've got enough time so you don't have to go back and beg for more later. And if you had to, it's not the end of the world. It's just write an amendment and say purchaser and seller agreed to extend the feasibility study period by 5 days. We had a delay and the inspector couldn't get there. So it shouldn't be a big deal. And typically with land, nobody's in a big hurry. So it shouldn't be a big deal. And if it is, then just, work accordingly. Let me see if I've missed anything. Zoning, paragraph 12 here. I've very rarely ever had to put anything regarding zoning in a contract, but Roanoke, the Roanoke and Roanoke County area, Botetourt, Bedford, I don't know a lot about those markets, but here, New River Valley, almost every piece of land in this area is zoned agricultural. And so A1 is a very standard zoning. And I mean, other than business, A1 will work for just about any need that most buyers have. So if you get into business needs, that's a time when you're going to want to select item 12 or paragraph 12, so you can talk to the planning and zoning ordinance and figure out what it is and what they might allow. If you have an A1 parcel and you wanted to convert it to business 1 or B3 or a higher layer of residential, maybe an R4 or R5, as long as you talk to the planning department, find out that it's possible, and always make sure it's in writing. And my preference is to have the buyer client do that step themselves so that I don't become liable for bad information later. Say your client, say you call planning and zoning today on a parcel in Shawsville, and the person, it's Friday afternoon at 2 and they're ready to get out of work. And they say, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want. You report that back, and then the person buys the property and finds out I can't put my pig farm on it. That's going to come back on us. So just anytime it's possible, either do that call to the planning ordinance yourself with the client present, or have the client do it for you. And I always recommend they get it in writing.
All
And
those
if-
questions are rabbit holes, you know? That's what I tell buyers, or, you know, just, man, that's a rabbit hole, because I don't know where you're going with this. And once you hear an answer, you might change your thinking, or you want another question answered. And so I said, I don't know where to go with that. You
Right
need to
on.
take care of that yourself.
Just get it in writing or ask them to do it themselves. That's the easiest way to deal with it, I think. But they're all legitimate questions, because if they're spending $1 million for a piece of property and they find out that the business that's going to make them, you know, a ton of money can't be done, then it's ultimately on your head.
Right?
So reasonable consideration. Next paragraph, paragraph 13. Always knew what this was because I went through real estate school, but I never dealt with it until transaction years back. And anybody that doesn't know this, land use and rollback taxes, people that have property, is typically farmers, have the ability to get an offset tax amount. They're discounted and can pay a lower tax rate on their property as long as it's in farm use, or if they're using it as a farm, if they're using it as an income producing property, they can get this tax break. So when we come in 20 years later, Farmer Joe's been farming this property for 25 years, and we find out through this process that the property is in land use. That property, before it can be sold, those discounted taxes have to be reimbursed back to the ordinance. And so it's not a lot of money. It's the reimbursement is a portion of the total tax that was discounted. And yeah, I don't remember what it is. If you've got a land value or a land tax rate of 89 cents a thousand, then maybe they discount it by 20 cents per thousand. That 20 cents per thousand equates to $140 a year, let's say, over 20 years. I don't know what that math is, but that's how it's calculated. And either the seller or the buyer will have to satisfy that deficit to the county before the property can transfer. And so this contract reads that the seller will, if it is or isn't, and that the seller will make it right with the county. And some sellers aren't willing to satisfy that because they feel like they're given a discount on the sale price of the land. This is all point of negotiation. So if it turns out the buyer's going to satisfy it, if it turns out the seller's going to satisfy it, if they decide they're going to split it at closing, check has to be cut to the county, and that's the only part that anybody really cares about. County wants to get paid. So I wanted to make mention of that in case anybody had never seen it, because it's definitely an important part and definitely changes the value of the property, especially if the property's been in land use for 50, 60, 70 years. So worth consideration.
The Virginia Tech website has an excellent document on that.
Awesome. Yeah, and I've only dealt with it once. I sold a 100 and some acre piece of raw land. And honestly, I don't know how the owner ever got it into land use, because there was nothing there was no money earned off of it. Maybe it was, he said he had a tree farm on it or something, but this was just completely raw land that hadn't been touched in years. But the thing for me was it had been in land use for 50 years, and the amount of taxes that were owed back to the county, I would think it was like $6,300 or something. And ultimately it made no difference at all, but it was a factor that had to be tabulated, and the attorney had to pay it back. Let's see here. Title insurance, you guys know all this stuff. I'm assuming you guys are all pros. That paragraph 21, land sold by the boundary, not by the acre. my old business partner sold, his father passed away and they had a farm in Rocky Mount, and he had an 80-acre farm, fenced and cross fence, barns. I mean, it was a really nice setup, and they raised, I think they raised buffalo or bison or something on the property. Anyways, they found out during the process, they got it surveyed, and they found out they actually owned 120 acres. So it significantly increased the price of the property. But if you had written this in there, then you've got all that total property inside the boundaries encapsulated, and then you haven't limited yourself to an 80-acre sale. So in that case, it was sold by the acre, and it was subject to a survey done by a surveyor agreeable to both parties. And when they found the extra 40 acres, it increased their price a lot of money. So definitely good to have that language in there to try and get it from the buyer standpoint. It's good to get in as much as you can for the buyer. Seller standpoint, just be mindful that that is something that should be considered in a land sale. Let's see here. I think we've covered just about everything. If you have a property that's got a house on it, and this comes up a lot on rural properties, you've got an old farmhouse built in 1915, you're going to need to get a lead-based paint disclosure. You're going to need that residential property disclosure. You're going to need a septic disclosure. Of course, our RESPA for the office, Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act form. So just be mindful of what you're selling and what's expected. But if you sell a house on a property, you better have those documents in place because you are expected to.
So Frank, going back to the first page where it says description or something, how did you get around that for number 21, additional terms? What did you put there?
Well,
so you still write something in there, yet at the end you put that additional.
correct. Yeah, so it's really loose at the beginning. It says that many acres plus or minus. So it could be 27 acres up to 100 acres. But by paragraph 21, if you put to be sold by the boundary, not by the acre, then whatever's flagged, whatever you've got a map of, however the boundary lies is what you're buying. And I mean, this is all a variable. Somebody might see that and say, no, I'm selling you only 13 acres. That's typically that type of situation is going to come up when it is subject to a survey. Most people selling raw land like what we're talking about here with 27 acres, they're selling the property and they don't care about if it's an extra acre or two or even an extra 20. They probably don't even know they have it. But if you put that in 21, you're always covering your buyer's interest best because you're making sure to get them as much as you can for the money.
Great. Okay, good.
Just a simple little, that's one of my old realtor friends, dead and gone now. One of my old realtor friends told me to use that and served well
Yeah.
over the years. Let me see if we got any other documents I haven't touched on here. I told you it's going to be pretty quick and easy, but EMD, residential one-time show. I'm not using the COVID form. I think we're supposed to, but I haven't had an instance where that's that big of a deal here. Did anybody else, have we lost? No one, have you done a land contract? Faye, have you run into this yet?
I've seen them. Back when I was working for Austin in 2019, he had a couple land pieces. So I've seen the contracts and I'm just trying to like refamiliarize myself with the wording and how it's different from like a house.
Good deal. Well, and I say this all the time. I mean, our contracts change often. So I think it's a great idea to, even if you're not in a transaction, get into zip form, download a document, either print it or do it on the computer, but read them cover to cover, do it 2 or 3 times and just stay familiar with or stay current with it. Jake, our buyer's agent, Jake pointed out something to me the other day. I've been telling it wrong. Jake, I don't remember what that was now, but because it's something that changed like 3 months ago and I completely missed it. So it's good to stay fresh on them. And they don't change often, but they will change documents 2 or 3 times a year. I serve on Standard Forms in Richmond, that committee through the Virginia Realtors, and I'm involved in a lot of the changes that happen. Unfortunately, they change primarily the Virginia Realtors forms, and the Roanoke forms sort of follow suit after changes are made on the Virginia Realtors. So it's just a process. Kelsey, are you checking messages? Hang on one second, guys. We got a bunch of messages here. Tim asked me a question here. Could you have the buyer pay fees, keep it in agriculture? Not pay fees per se, but assume the agriculture status. So buyer continues to get break seller. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Tim. The idea is that the buyer may want to continue to use this property as a farm. Those fees for the land use, they don't have to be reimbursed at that point if it's going to continue in that use. So great point, man. I didn't even think about that. A lot of times people just want to sell a property and be done with it, and the buyer wants it for a completely different use. So, but if it's going to stay in land use, stay as a farm, tree farm, cattle farm, chicken farm, whatever. If it's going to stay in that same use, then you don't have to reimburse the county at that point. Just at the time when it's going to come out of that land use, that's when it has to be paid back. Let's see. I think I got all the questions covered. Anybody else want to throw anything out there? That's a big negative. Well, listen, I had Kelsey send everyone an email with those service providers, and that's Steve Dalton with Southwest Soils, Nan Gray with Soil Works. They're both soil evaluation people. And then I've got Rohrer and Fenton and Haynes well drilling. And is that all that was on the list? So if we don't do a ton of land, I mean, we sell 3, 4, 5 a year. But if anybody has a question that comes up and you're in the midst of or getting ready to write one and you have questions, any of us here are happy to help. You call me. We're in Christiansburg, easy to find and easy to talk to. So happy to help with any questions that come up on anything real estate for that matter. But land is kind of a different breed, and not everybody does it. So if something weird or funky happens, please reach out.
Thank you, Frank.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming, guys. Look for an email from Kelsey. Kelsey is here beside me, my assistant, and she's going to pop out an email with those numbers. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Have a great day.